with regard to our practice of meditation, which we often call deep tantric meditation, it is not so obvious, and or it's not something that we can subjectively appraise in it kind of immediately of this idea of being deep in meditation. Our subjective experience is often complex during our practice of meditation. And it is often the case during our meditation practice that our awareness is expanded or stretched so that it is still registering a fluctuation of thoughts, of memories, of emotions that are trickling through the awareness field, and that to some degree are still holding our attention. And so the person feels like, well, you know, what's happened here? Why am I actually deepening in meditation? And it's only as the practice proceeds that then another aspect of a certain kind of silence, a stillness, a suspension of the ordinary flow of thought, and a kind of opening, a sense of richness or fullness or satiation or a kind of a deep nourishment that begins to surge and upsurge from inside. And even that is something that's very difficult to appraise. When someone learns Neelakantha meditation, we say, don't judge the success or failure of your practice by the subjective experience of what happens during your meditation practice. In fact, the person who posed this question points to, you know, how do we know that it's having some benefit? Well, something happened in life. I was less irritable in a certain circumstance. It surprised me by changing my reactivity or responsiveness to some ordinary circumstance in which previously I might have predicted myself responding or reacting in a certain way, and I found myself spontaneously reacting or responding in a different, potentially better way, a more fulfilling way. So there is that. So it's not so easy to judge initially. As we proceed with the practice, however, and as we move through even years of practice, we do begin to recognize a kind of experience of a trajectory or movement of attention in what I just talked about, and I often talk about, a kind of spectrum of vibratory consciousness, and we begin to register more clearly as the inner impediments and the inner blockages are being removed by the practice itself. We can register, as it were, you know, I mean, these are silly analogies, but it's kind of like an elevator that has you know, we're going down the elevator and it has a transparent door and each floor has a kind of vista to it. We can recognize that experience of deepening, of settling, of opening, of transformation, a transformation that happens both in terms of how we experience, as it were, into that subjective experience of meditation, but also how we experience ourselves, a kind of transformation or a removal of surface layers of our ordinary identity that begin to reveal that what we really are is this exquisite, luminous, centered profundity of life itself that is increasing in its availability, in its presence, in its potency, in its kind of impact inside us in that way. But it is an excellent question. It's not necessarily so easy to judge. However, with regard to consciousness, with regard to reality, with regard to the structure of what has manifested or expressed itself in the complexity of the structure of the universe, the Tantric tradition, in a very simplistic but useful way, wants us to understand these different levels of the whole matter. And then depth is defined in terms of the apprehension or opening to progressively more subtle and more powerful layers or sort of dimensions of that reality, eventually to disclose a place that is very, very subtle and almost infinitely powerful, and eventually to step beyond that when we step, as it were, through the very center of the Bindu point into the transcendent. And when we step into the transcendent, then at least for a while, for most people, all thought, all ordinary conceptualization, all registering of separateness temporarily ceases and comes to a state of cessation. And when those experiences of samadhi, depth, of samapati, illuminative clarity, of samavesha, immersion into that transcendental depth happen for us in our practice, then we understand, yes, I have really, it's in a certain sense touched the bottom of the swimming pool. We're diving into an unsoundable depth of reality itself, traversing its many layers, beginning to become familiarized and recognize the different subjective experiences that occur at these different levels. And then we use this word deep. But we have to then also problematize the word. It's a useful word, but it has its limits, because in fact, eventually we will also come to register and understand and experience that what we're discovering at the so-called depth will subsequently reveal itself as having been present at the so-called surface and be in fact omnipresent throughout, so that this spatial directionality of deep and depth, or of high and height, etc., that we might use, whether we're using a kind of ascensional vocabulary or a descending vocabulary, an introversive vocabulary, these are useful forms of vocabulary to narrate different kinds of subjective experiences that occur at these different levels, that will occur repetitively and predictably, in a certain sense, through practice, but that then at a certain moment also the entire notion of dimensionality will itself implode and be transcended, and so on, at what I'm saying, where now the recognition that what was previously only discoverable in the transcendental depth of deepest consciousness now begins to reveal itself as having been overlooked, but yet always present at what was previously being termed the surface in that way. So it's a useful but limited or relative distinction that allows us to speak about these things in a subjective kind of way. And yes, the tradition wants to create a map of all of this, but the map, this is this famous phrase from anthropology, the map is not the territory, and our exploration of the territory is what is important. The map is useful in that exploration, but it does not suffice merely to examine maps. I mean, I love maps. I still have despite the fact that we can pull up the map of the whole planet on our phone these days, it's an amazing thing. I still have boxes and boxes of maps, and I love maps. But the truth of the matter is, as we know, there's a difference between looking at a map and actually going there. And the map facilitates the journey. It facilitates the comprehension of the experiences. It actually supports us in having experiences of various sorts, but it is also then something that eventually the map is transcended and abandoned eventually. So anyway, there's a lot to say about this. It is a subjectively descriptive word. It is also objectively a reflection of the tantric vision of reality that narrates a sort of a sequentiality of structure that then can be labeled in terms of its location. And I started out talking about bondage limits attention to the stula level of superficiality. And so we have this vocabulary of the superficial versus the profound, the external versus the internal. All of these are just ways of trying to orient ourselves within the sort of otherwise disorienting subjectivities of our life, and so on. So depth takes on meaning once you've been there. In a certain sense, if you haven't tasted or experienced the depth, then you're like, what the heck is that person talking about? It takes on actual meaning when it's no longer simply a category from a map, but is actually descriptive of a condition of divine experience.